Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar about innovations in SEL action research and practice. Before we begin the program, I'll review just a few quick housekeeping items. We will be accepting questions throughout the webinar, and we'll hold a Q&A session at the end of the presentation once all of the 2018 Joseph Easons Award winners have presented. Please send in your questions at any time throughout the presentation. To do that, just type your question into the top box of your control panel, push send, and I'll get the question and put it into the queue to be answered at the end. Since we have several speakers with us today, when you send a question, if you could please just indicate who you're asking the question of so that we're sure to connect you with the right person. If it's a question that you'd like everyone to chime in on, that's fine too, but if there is someone specific you'd like to have answered, just let me know. If you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the questions feature to get my attention, and I'll do my best to resolve the problem for you. We will be sharing a recording of the webinar and the presentation slides with you following today's presentation. You'll need to keep an eye on your email inbox tomorrow for details on how to access those materials. That follow-up email will also include links to some of the resources that are referenced here today, some articles written about SEL by Joseph Easons, who this award is in honor of. And so you'll want to make sure you keep an eye out for that inbox so you can access all of those great resources. All right, let's get started. I'm pleased to introduce today's hosts, Kim Schoenert-Reichel, who is an applied developmental psychologist and professor at the University of British Columbia and a CASEL board member. Kim is joined today by Dr. Rob Jagers, who is Vice President of Research at CASEL. Kim, are you ready to get us started?
I am. Thank you so much, Emily, for organizing all of this. So I'm going to welcome everyone. This is very exciting. This is actually our first ever Zins Award winners webinar for CASEL, and so we're excited to share this information and also get your feedback on how it goes. This webinar is being organized by CASEL, or the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, or an organization that was founded in 1994 to help make social and emotional learning an essential part of education from pre-K all the way to high school. CASEL's work leverages state, district, and school context with a worldwide connection to collaborators, and the goals with advancing the science of SEL, expanding high-quality evidence-based SEL practice, and improve state and federal policies. If you're not that aware of CASEL, I really urge you to go to the CASEL website and just look at a treasure trove of resources, including an SEL district resource center, along with many other articles and information. But let me, next slide. But let me just get started by telling you a little bit about the person who this award is for, the Joseph Easons Award. Joe Zins, as we call him, was really a pioneer in the field of social and emotional learning. It was Joe's work that really integrated the research and theory into practice. And Joe was really a leader in the field whom we lost way too soon. His work really exemplified the blending of the rigorous scientific research along with effective practice. He was both nationally and internationally renowned in his area, and published a number of articles on social and emotional learning, which several of them you will get as part of this webinar. There'll be resources that will be linked to this. Since 2007, the Joseph E. Zins Awards and honors outstanding action researchers at different stages of their career. There's early career awards for outstanding contributions to action research in social and emotional learning. Really, those people who are showing that integration of doing the rigorous research and putting it into practice, just like Joe did. And then a Distinguished Scholar Award for outstanding contributions to action research in social emotional learning. And this is really for an individual who's really, like Joe, trailblazed in this field for a number of years to really make a difference in children's lives. Next slide. So today we are very fortunate to have three of these award winners, the three winners from this past year. Both Dr. Gregory and Dr. Camille Farrington were the winners of the Early Career Award this year, the Joseph Easons Early Career Award, and Dr. David Osher has won the Distinguished Scholar Award, the Joseph Easons for Action Research. So we're going to begin with Anne, and I'm going to just read a little bit about their bios before we before we go into there, just Anne Gregory, you can go back one. She's an associate professor in School of Psychology at Rutgers University's Graduate School of Applied and Professional Psychology. Then we're going to move on to Dr. Camille Farrington, and she's the Managing Director and Senior Research Associate at the University of Chicago Consortium on School Research, and Camille will be followed then by Dr. David Osher, who is the Vice President and Institute Fellow of the American Institutes for Research. So, Anne, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much. First, I just want to express my gratitude for this honor and honoring Dr. Zins, who's made such seminal contributions. And I also want to give a big shout out to my esteemed colleagues on this panel. Next slide. So I'm just going to get going real fast here. As we know, schools across the nation are undertaking discipline reform to move away from punitive approaches to behavior and reduce the pernicious effects of exclusionary discipline on African American and Black youth. And nowadays in schools across the nation, school boards are redoing their codes of conduct. They're learning about culturally responsive education. They're bringing in new programming to increase both the social and emotional competencies of both students and staff. And as approaches roll out in these areas, I would argue we need to think very critically. We need to be vigilant that dynamics of power and privilege don't reproduce themselves. So I'm going to put my key takeaway today for my 10-minute presentation right out front. If we don't consider issues of equity when implementing SEL reforms, we may inadvertently perpetuate inequality. We need to be careful that our SEL work does not lead to another form of tracking, sorting, and stigmatizing. If educators start to label historically marginalized students as low on something like relationship skills or low on responsible decision-making, we may be creating another set of deficit-oriented labels. At the same time, we also want to make sure that there's fair access to SEL program, especially for marginalized groups. And so we have to, that's part of my framework of equitable supports, that there's a kind of a check that schools can use to use an equity lens as they check on the fidelity of implementation. So I would argue that yes, we want SEL skill building, yes, we want to work on relationship building, community building, but we want to do so while centering equity. Next slide. So in this framework, I think it's important to consider dimensions of fidelity of implementation as schools are rolling out innovations. And there's a lot of different dimensions out there, but there are three that I've kind of myself have been focusing on. The issue of quantity, the dosage of the intervention. Are students receiving enough of the intervention? For that matter, are staff receiving enough? So what can we honestly expect from a single workshop that, for instance, aims to heighten self-awareness about implicit racial bias among your staff? We need to be realistic to think about processes of change. And I think those critical questions can help us think creatively about how to embed sustained self-reflection in the busy lives of educators. Now, when thinking about quality, we also need to be checking in on whether the core tenets of the work are there. We know there's a lot of initiative fatigue out there, so we need to be checking in. Are some of these programs or initiatives being implemented in a superficial manner? How can we kind of deepen the work and keep checking for core tenets of the program? Now, equity, I think, is really multidimensional. So with new programming, I always want to know whether historically marginalized groups have fair access to the intervention. But I also want to know to what degree the intervention is what I call bias aware. Is it respectful, and is it culturally conscious? And in my perspective, a culturally conscious approach means explicitly considering how issues of culture, race, power, and privilege are operating. I want to give you just a few examples since these concepts can feel abstract. If an intervention is an SEL curricula, for example, does it respectfully recognize the range of competencies students bring to the table? So including competencies such as code switching, for example, as students traverse home and school cultures and adeptly navigate the difference between the two. Or, for example, we might ask whether our social emotional competencies privilege white middle class cultural frames of reference. So an example might be when working with students on learning about self-regulating their emotions and behavior, are we drawing on a very narrow and culturally biased way of conceptualizing what self-control looks like? Next slide, please. I myself have been working in the area of restorative practices and thinking about how we can implement tiered systems of equitable supports. So when we're thinking about RP or RJ, we're thinking about community building at tier 1 and repairing harm at tier 2 and 3. And many of the nonprofit training organizations I'm working with also include an explicit focus on increasing social justice and reducing racial inequality. Next slide, please. Over the past 15 years, my own focus has been on addressing racial disparities in school discipline. And we know from decades of research that both Black males and Black females are issued suspension at substantially higher rates than white males and females. We also know using statistical controls that Black and white gaps remain when accounting for confounds, including when we account for student and teacher reported behavior. And here's just one example of a study by Morris and Perry in 2016. However, there's dozens out there. So the results to me suggest we need to consider the racial dynamics of power, privilege, and bias when we're doing school discipline reform. And I would also say, when we're doing reforms related to SEL. Next slide, please. But as I'm doing work and research with schools, I encourage us not to think narrowly about Black and white disparities, but to think in an intersectional manner, which I think more and more people are doing. Students and staff have multiple identities and can be marginalized along numerous dimensions. So when thinking about equitable supports, we need to think about diversity in a broad manner. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm just going to kind of whiz through some examples of what kind of data schools can collect to help them do some fidelity checks around the quantity, quality, and equity. And more schools are asked to be data driven, but I think it's important to give some examples because this can also start to feel quite abstract. So my examples focus on restorative practice, given that's a lot of where my research is right now. Next slide, please. So the first thing I've been working on is identifying what are the tenets of good community building circles. If you walk into a room doing community circles in advisory, for example, what should we be looking for? So here are some of the core tenets that I've worked on with colleagues identifying of what to observe. But we also need efficient ways to gather from students' perspectives. Next slide. So I give you an example here of a exit survey that we've given out in schools, and this is some data from one particular project. We collected 124 exit surveys. 92% of students said they agreed that they personally cared about the topic being discussed. To me, this indicates circle topics felt relevant to a vast majority of students, and relevancy to me is a part of student voice, and student voice I see also as a part of issues around equity. Next slide, please. At the same time, at tier 1 in the same school, we wanted to know if the students and staff perceived a culturally conscious school climate. So on surveys, we asked them whether they felt represented in educational material, whether they felt negatively stereotyped, whether they felt that they received fair treatment. So I think it's important for schools to start leveraging school climate data to ask around these kinds of issues around culture and diversity, and social justice. In this RJ school, we see a vast majority of students agreed that adults in the school encouraged awareness of social issues affecting their culture, which was good news in my perspective. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm rushing through in my short time, but now I want to give you a couple examples of tier 2 and 3, how to think about equity, how to check in on your interventions. So next slide, please. In that same school, I asked U Schools climate surveys to ask, did Black students, students in special ed, and LGBTQ students report similar frequency in restorative interactions with adults in the school? And this is, to me, standard practice, that we need to look at multiple subgroups within the school to find out if they're having equitable access to your innovations, whatever their SEL innovations are. And I was pleased to see that in these schools, we found no statistically significant differences in access or students reporting the frequency of restorative interactions. In other words, there was students from diverse racial and ethnic groups, students with IEPs or not, students identified as straight versus LGBTQ students reported similar frequency of restorative interactions. So again, some good news. Next slide, please. I've also been working with Yolianian and Denver Public School colleagues to analyze school discipline data, and we found that discipline-referred students who participated in restorative interventions in the fall were less likely to receive discipline referrals in the spring. They were also less likely to receive out-of-school suspension, but from an equity perspective, we wanted to know, is there fair access to restorative interventions? And then, so we tested whether for those students who were referred to discipline, whether they were utilizing restorative interventions in equal rates. We found that with only one exception, diverse students in DPS seemed to have fair access. The one exception, however, brought up a lot of questions. We found that compared to other discipline-referred students, emergent bilingual students who had been issued a discipline referral had a lower odds of participating in restorative intervention. So it just raises a lot of questions. You know, is this due to the fact that maybe those trained in restorative conferences were not multilingual? Could there be healthy cultural suspicion? It really just triggers a district to look deeper. So in conclusion, I'm going to wrap up now. Next slide, please. As a field, I believe we have a lot more to learn about what a culturally conscious, bias-aware SEL approach really looks like in everyday practice. What is it, if we walk into a school and this is happening, what behaviors do we see? But at this point, we know all too well that opportunity gaps abound. Students have unequal access to high quality, rigorous instruction with socially and emotionally supportive environments. So as schools undertake reforms and move away from punitive approaches to behavior and towards SEL approaches, I would argue we really need to remain vigilant that we don't inadvertently deny access to more marginalized groups or inadvertently create new sets of deficit-oriented labels. Thanks for your attention this morning and afternoon.
Thank you, Anne. That was wonderful, and we did get a lot of comments. People are really fascinated by your information, and we know that folks are having to go very quickly through it so that we can hear from all of our award winners. So just as a reminder to folks, you will be getting an email tomorrow with a link to the presentation deck so you can spend a little more time with the information that Anne went over and the information that Camille is about to go over. Camille, are you able to unmute yourself?
Yes. Hello.
Great. Oh, it looks like we lost you again.
Okay, here I am. Okay, so thanks very much. And like Anne, I really wanted to start by just saying how thrilled I am to be here with Anne and David, and what an honor it is to get this particular award. Easons not only was contributed in terms of seminal research to the field of social emotional learning, but he was also a human being that his friends and colleagues felt strongly enough that they wanted to put this award together in his honor. So I much appreciate that. So I want to talk about the science of learning and development and applying that to our current schooling paradigms. And I would argue that the primary paradigm for thinking about school really is at odds with the science of learning and development in some fundamental ways. And I want to try and flag those, and particularly as we think about social emotional learning in schools. So if this picture here, the idea of, you know, kind of a banking model of education where teachers can kind of pour facts into kids' heads, that on one hand, we recognize that this is ludicrous, that in fact, if it was as easy as this, students would get better test scores, for example. But we understand that there is still, that this model really is very much drives everything we do in schools. So with this idea of, you know, we'll teach content and then we'll test how well people did on this. We'll take baseline measures of what you know and then measure growth over time. And it really it conceives of knowledge and facts and procedures as atomized kind of discrete bits that are decontextualized, that are really kind of mischaracterizes human cognition as very individualistic, acontextual, very kind of a self-contained phenomenon. And then there's a second half of this paradigm, which has to do with merit and deservingness. Because teachers can't just pour facts into kids' heads. We all know that learners also need to be actively engaged in learning and put forth effort to learn. But within our existing paradigm, we really think of this as almost a moral characteristic of kids, that either they work hard and they try, or they don't. And if they don't, then they don't really deserve to learn or be advanced or to move forward. And I don't think we consciously believe this to be true, but that it's embedded in a lot of the paradigms around this kind of banking model of education. Next slide, please. Now, very heartening to see that we've moved into a much, moved out of only worrying about test scores and academic content knowledge, and are thinking more broadly about social emotional learning. And so we see that schools are actively hoping to promote ideas of student agency and empathy and social skills and growth mindset. But unfortunately, we too often are applying our same old schooling model to this area of social emotional learning. And so the idea that mindsets and social emotional skills, again, are like automatized individual things that students either have or don't have, and that we have to teach to them. And I think it kind of misunderstands a lot of what the science of learning and development would tell us. Okay, next slide, please. So in 2012, my colleagues and I at the University of Chicago put together this Teaching Adolescents to Become Learners, which was reviewing the literature on social and emotional and non-cognitive factors, and tried to understand how these things fit together. Now, the three bottom squares here, the academic performance, academic behaviors, academic perseverance, is very much mirrors the kind of paradigm I was just talking about, in that we know that students' individual behaviors are what produce their performance. So they have to come to school, they have to study, they have to be prepared, participate in class, and that those behaviors then contribute to their performance and their grades and their academic learning. And we know that academic perseverance, how hard they work at all of that, is directly affected to the kind of quality and consistency of their behaviors and their performance. But all of that is set within a much larger picture. And particularly, I want to draw attention to the importance of academic mindsets as being the thing, or one of the things that really drives perseverance, behaviors, and performance. And in this report, we talked about the four particular mindsets. I belong in this learning community. My ability and competence grow with my effort. I can succeed at this, and this work has value for me, as being beliefs that are strongly related to how hard kids work and how well they do in school. And then those mindsets and that whole phenomenon of a kid's psychological experience of a classroom happens within specific school and classroom contexts that shape all of those beliefs and attitudes. And so what we are kind of hypothesizing in this model is that classroom conditions are going to shape how a kid experiences schooling, and therefore shape their perseverance, their behaviors, and performance. Next slide, please. So after we came out with that, in the last 6 years, we have developed and been testing out a survey instrument that now we've collected from tens of thousands of students all over the country. And the survey design is what you see here, that we ask each student about 2 different of their 4 core classes. And we ask them to tell us about the classroom conditions, and particularly about teacher support, how well the teacher knows them, how relevant the work is, how well students work together in that room, how clear the goals are, those kinds of things. And then we ask them about their mindsets, learning strategies, perseverance, and behavior within the context of, in this case, Algebra 2. And then we ask them that same set of questions again about, in this case, their English 10 class. And then we get their grades from administrative records for those courses. And so we're able to see how much does the classroom conditions in any given classroom affect students' reports of their own mindsets and behaviors, and then how well is that borne out in the grades they actually deserve, or I'm sorry, earn. Next slide, please. And what we've found consistently in virtually every place that we've tested this is that indeed classroom conditions predict students' reports of their mindsets, learning strategies, perseverance, and behaviors, and that those things in turn predict students' academic performance. And one thing really important to note here is this is not just true when you're comparing, one student to another, but even when you're comparing the same student across two classrooms, that if a student is in a classroom that their peers rate as being higher on things like support and close connections in the classroom and clear goals and relevance, that individual student is likely to report higher, more positive mindsets in that class. They're more likely to report that they have more perseverance in that class, that they're more likely to do their homework in that class, for example, and then in turn they earn better grades than that exact same student in another class where the classroom conditions are maybe a little less favorable. And we've seen this over and over and over again. Next slide, please. So if we step back and think more broadly about the things when we're thinking about learning and development in a school, or in school or out of school, but particularly in a school context, we care about these small foundational components, these things that build over time: self-regulation, knowledge and skills, mindsets, and values. But we ultimately hope that those lead to these larger outcomes of a sense of agency and integrated identity and a set of socially valued competencies, including social emotional competencies as well as academic competencies. Next slide, please. And development matters a lot, and we think of schools should be developmental spaces so that teachers and educators should really know at any given point in a child's development what are this larger set of foundational components that in their development that are most kind of the things that are most important to develop, or the things that are developing at that moment in time, so that those can be taken into account as they are creating their classrooms and planning their lessons. Next slide, please. We also know that rather than learning being a function of pouring knowledge into somebody's head or even just exposing them to knowledge, that learning happens through action and reflection, and that young people need opportunities for encountering, tinkering, choosing, practicing, contributing, and then opportunities to reflect on all of those things: describing, evaluating, connecting, envisioning, integrating, and that is in fact how both academic content knowledge is best built to lead to really deep understanding, as well as how social emotional competencies develop, as well as how mindsets develop and values develop and self-regulatory skills develop and identity develops. So that, next slide, please. As we think about schools, really the organizing principle of every student's pre-K-12 experience ought to be around making sure that everybody has supportive adults around them, that they have rich developmental experiences and meaningful opportunities to be engaged in the world. Next slide, please. Right now I'm involved, my team at the consortium is involved in the Building Equitable Learning Environments Network, which is an opportunity to be working with 10 nonprofit organizations around the country that are all school intermediary organizations working with their own networks of schools. And here we are focusing not just on the science of learning and development, but really thinking about what does that mean to apply in a school system that we know produces inequitable outcomes. Next slide, please. And we define equitable schools as places that are designed to be responsive, like very much like Anne was saying, responsive to the assets, needs, and cultures of young people who inhabit them, to be developmentally appropriate, and to be participatory and liberatory. And by that, it means not just that schools are designed to teach and test and rank students according to where they line up in terms of how well they can retain the information we expose them to, but rather how do we think about making sure that their experiences makes them more free to pursue their own and equipped to pursue the interests and the goals and purposes that are most important to them. And in order to get there, we have to make sure that every student is engaged in rich developmental experiences that build their capacity to engage in the world, and that every student is seen and known and loved and inspired and cared for and challenged by a community of conscious adults. Okay, next slide, please. So this loops back to our thoughts about measurement. And as we are focusing on social emotional learning, I think that very similar to Anne's point about the data that she's been collecting, that the metrics that are most likely to yield reliable, actionable data are perceptions of students' learning settings, measuring the opportunities they have for developmental experiences, measuring the quality of students' connections to adults, and put less emphasis, particularly to start, on measuring the competencies of individual students. I think that that is fraught with measurement challenges, and it also kind of recreates this dominant paradigm of learning as being something that's very individualized and acontextualized. Last slide. Just want to give a little shout out to our newest report, which is really a translational document. It's short and trying to pull together all of this research to say what are the implications for educators in really kind of practical terms. Thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Thank you, Camille. We really appreciate you providing all that information. And just again, as a reminder to folks, you will receive a copy of the PowerPoint deck so you can dive a little deeper into the information that Camille as well as Anne reviewed. So we will move on to our third researcher, David.
Thank you very much. I learned so much from Anne and Camille, and I continue to do it. Okay. If I was a younger person, I'd say I so agree with Anne and Camille because it's really spot on. I also I'm so honored to be, to get an award in Joseph's name. I mean, he influenced me, and also from Castle that really has helped me learn so much. Given the gnarly nature of the issues that surround equity, I want to contextualize them as a historical sociologist, and at the same time, do it within the work that I've done over the past few years, where I had an opportunity to synthesize what we know about learning and development, the science of learning and development that Camille talked about. And let me just locate what I'm doing here within the arc of what we've heard. Anne correctly talks about the risks that we have to address. Schools are risk factors, and we keep on creating risk factors and amplify them for young people. Camille moves us into the possibilities from learning, and to a type of learning that can be participatory and liberatory. And I think that's really, really important. And I just want to continue this. Okay, so next slide first. And actually, let me just say that I was interested to hear Algebra 2 because when I first chose to come to AIR, I chose to do it because the then about to be president of AIR and somebody else had actually done a major study looking at what was the biggest predictor for African-American young people going on to college, and it was success in algebra. And I think Algebra 2 is really very, very key. And we also know from other work that success in algebra and handling the ambiguities of learning and digging into the struggle is related to the types of skills that Camille has been talking about. Okay, so next slide, please. Social and emotional learning and its benefits are nested in a social historical context that affect what we see, how we make sense of what we see, with whom we interact, and what opportunities and responsibilities are afforded us. We're both shaped by these contexts which we build our lives, and we also influence others. SEL can help us purposefully, actively, and responsibly act as individuals and as citizens, particularly when the conditions are right. Next slide, please. The next slide, I've gone over that already, so thank you. Okay. Many of you probably know about PISA. Many countries in the developed West look at PISA scores to see how their countries are dealing with. And let me just have you listen to Andreas Schleicher, who runs PISA and the OECD indicators programs and who's now invested in SEL, and there's a study of it that I'm about to be an advisory board on tomorrow. Succeeding in this world requires the ability to be self-generative, creative, interdirective, socially aware, sensitive and responsible, flexible, and psychologically resilient. And just if you look at the other italices, what we have to do is build the cognitive, social, and emotional skills and values of humans, and at the same time to be able to handle adeptly the tensions and trade-offs that we face in this very, very complex world. Next slide. At the same time, we live in a world that is situated by inequality. And I call out this great historian who at the beginning of the 20th century, in the souls of Black folks, talked about the fact that the challenge of the 20th century was the challenge of the coal line. It's not just the challenge of the 20th century, it's the 21st century, and it involves the institutionalization of privilege and prejudice and the segregation of experiences that affect how we learn from each other. Next slide, please. What we want for young people is not just them being in school. What we want them is to be engulfed, engaged in deep, rich learning opportunities that involve personalization, deeper learning, critical thinking, creativity, design work, identity formation, perspective taking, meaning making, and collaborative learning and problem solving. What Camille's talking about, and I would argue that SEL skills are critical in those ways, and I'm not just arguing that. Look at the work of the National Research Council on deeper learning. Next slide, please. What's also important, though, is not just the ability to participate in deeper learning and succeed in Algebra 2, but what people do with those successes. And SEL, I think, is also about the ability to collaborate with others to promote equity and equitable outcomes and address the current and future challenges that the individual and world faces. And that means to be able to combine a sense of justice and injustice with the ability to address injustice strategically and to leverage one's skills to be able to work with others and move towards collective resilience and positive social change. Opportunities I've seen people struggling with in, say, South Africa, where they're really trying to develop this type of collective resilience. Next slide, please. And what this means is not ignoring something that I personally struggle with, which is self-regulation, but understanding that that's not the only thing that we have to develop. I mean, I believe in self-regulation. We developed a wonderful scale to measure it. It's also about self and social awareness, two parts of the Castle model, and relationship skills and support. The ability to be caring, to be humble, to really have a sense of agency and be able to code switch when one is dealing with forces of acculturation, and the ability to address effectively the impacts of institutionalized prejudice and privilege. Next slide, please. At the same time, it's not just for people who experience marginalization. It's for all of us. I mean, my colleague Juliet Berg and I recently completed a study where we looked at 135 frameworks regarding social and emotional competency. And what we discovered was it was only the frameworks regarding the cultural socialization of people of color and people of disabilities that talked about privilege. What we need is for everyone to also be aware of the impacts of privilege and to be able to handle both to prevent, but also to negotiate implicit bias, microaggressions, the generation and sustaining a stereotype threat, a lack of empathy and perspective taking, self-justifying thinking and mindsets, victim blaming, and competing oppression and struggles for dignity, which tend to separate people, all of whom often experience problems that they are trying to struggle with. Next slide, please. Even if people develop these skills, they're not enough. As Camille said, it's also about the conditions. And I would suggest, having spent now the last 15 years trying to understand the conditions for learning and looking at other work, that they're not just conditions for learning, they actually are. And now I'm going beyond the empirical data, conditions for well-being, and conditions for performance, and conditions for learning, teaching, and creativity. And they involve safety, and a key element of safety is emotional safety, not just physical safety. In fact, in our empirical work, it trumps physical safety. It's identity safety. It's the feeling of respect. It is the experience of connectedness and support, the experience of real challenge. And as Camille said, and we have empirical data regarding this, it's being in an environment where the people around you, both yourself, the peers, and the adults, are socially and emotionally competent. And that relates to the supports they get, both the teachers and the adults. And the last slide. The support is critical, and let's take the case of teachers, so that they can do what we've learned from the science of learning and development, and that's to attune to young people, to be able to handle the stress that they face, and to act in a culturally responsive manner. And, you know, we have both studied this in a variety of ways. My colleagues at AIR have been doing a bunch of important pieces of work to try to support teachers in handling these issues, and some of the resources that we'll provide address this. And now let me go to the last slide. In fact, let me go one more slide because I've made these points already. I'm ending here not because it's a book I have, it's a book that actually has been written by myself and people you know, like Roger Weisberg, and my wife and good colleague Trina Osher, but also by 20 odd of my AIR colleagues, putting together what we know regarding how you could create safe, equitable, and engaging schools. And I wanted it to be for deeper learning, but Harvard felt that that would make it too long, but just know that's there. We can do it, and we can do it if you do the types of things that Camille and Anne are talking about. And I thank you again for your time.
Thank you, David. We appreciate that. And just so everyone knows, this slide here has quite a few resources that have been shared, so you'll get access to that when we send this out by email. And David has also shared some other resources that we'll include in that follow-up email for you to download and explore. So thank you to all of our award winners for sharing their research and their insights. And we are going to now hear from Rob Jagers with Castle to give us a little wrap up.
Yes, so first, congratulations to my colleagues for the outstanding work that they have been engaged in and the fantastic presentations that were just so chock full of important information and also directions for future work. I'll be fairly brief here so that we can open it up for questions. Certainly, one of the through lines in the presentations are around issues of equity, which are pivotal to the well-being of our society and, in fact, the global community. Going forward, really unpacking, I think, issues of social advantage and disadvantage from the kind of intersectional perspective that Anne offered up, loom as things that we just have to grapple with, and that would be both for young people as well as adults. Because historically inequities have been experienced both by people of color and black, brown, yellow, etc., the entire rainbow, as well as gender, as well as class, as well as ability status. The reality is that people are not just of one social category, but there are intersecting social categories, and their experiences need to be better understood and unpacked in the context of the type of work that my colleagues have been talking about. Another key factor going forward, or key consideration going forward, is really implementation quality and local adaptation of work. All of my colleagues alluded to context as important considerations. And historically, the field has been driven and defined largely by randomized controlled trials and other forms of experimental study, and appropriately so. However, in work that I've been fortunate to be involved in with Camille and Stephanie Jones and Mark Brackett, we've tried to think about what the next generation of research ought to feature. And one of those features, I'll call it here, is really research practitioner partnerships that allow us to dig in around co-constructed problems of practice in search of shared understandings of solutions to those problems of practice. It also allows us then to understand local factors in a more nuanced way so that we can figure out what is transferable, what is generalizable, and what is context specific. The issue also of adult-student relationships is pivotal going forward. The potential power imbalances, and here along lines of both race, class, gender, but also age, I think are things that have kind of haunted us as a society. So when my colleagues, Camille in particular, well, Camille and Ann both alluded to youth voice, setting conditions, relational conditions where youth have voice as well as choice is something that's terribly important to the type of change that we all agree can and should occur for our young people. We've talked about action research, and in many respects, the type of work that could occur in school is in fact action research, where young people are actively involved as producers and critical consumers of knowledge, thereby featuring young people as experts of their own lived experience, and also the constructors of the world that we envision. This, of course, has to take place in the context of classrooms and schools, but also families and communities are also terribly important context to consider. And how do we leverage the relationships outside of school so that the school experience for the broader community is enhanced and in fact optimized. David alluded to the international context for the work, and I think that also is looms on the horizon as something that we need to consider moving forward. As some of you all may know, CASEL has a conference, the 2019 SEL Exchange, and we are looking forward to having a national conference, but in fact an international conference where we can begin to share ideas with our colleagues from around the globe. So I will leave it there and invite questions. Again, congratulations to my colleagues. They've done and will do outstanding work. It is in the spirit of Joe Zins, and I heard, Emily, that We will be sharing some of Joe's writings. I think it's terribly important. He is, we're standing on his shoulders as well as other forerunners in the field. And a close read of that work will point to many of the issues that have been surfaced here today, both in the comments by my colleagues and the reports on their research, but also the comments that I just shared. Joe was a fantastic scholar and wonderful human being, and my colleagues are moving in that spirit. And so congratulations again to them, and thank you all for attending the webinar.
Thank you, Rob, for that nice summary. And yes, as you said, we will be sharing some links to articles by Joe Zinn, so keep an eye on that follow-up email. As you can tell from the many times I've referenced it, it's going to be chock full of information that I know you won't want to miss. We do have a little time for some questions to our award winners. So I'm going to go ahead and start with one that actually is for all of you. And it is, are we asking of SEL interventions what we should be asking of the organization of the entire school culture and climate? Anne, I don't know if you want to kick us off or if someone else does.
Sure, I'd be happy to kick it off. I think that's a really good question. I have made the case that a lot of our SEL programming can start to become very student-centric, where we lose thinking about the organizational conditions, and I think that was referenced a lot today, the kind of developmental opportunities for learning, the educators in the building and their own competencies. So an ecological model of SEL environments and programming has been put out there, but I think it's just for us to keep pushing back on that, because we can quickly swoop into very individual-centered ways of thinking about skill building, and not think about how is the context in which these students are learning also kind of socially, emotionally intelligent. So it's a great thing to keep in mind, and thanks for the opportunity to kind of reinforce that.
I would just thank you, Anne. I agree entirely with what you just said, and I would say if there's one thing that I would hope everybody takes away from this webinar is exactly that point.
And this is David. I recently read a book that I can't name now that basically said that to really turn schools around for young people, social and emotional learning has to be a way of life. And I also think to really turn it around, opportunities for young people to develop their social and emotional and cognitive skills requires also environments that actually build the collective as well as individual skills and competencies of adults, and also at the same time supports them. People flourish when they are in flourishing communities. Thank you.
All right, Anne, this is actually one directed from your part of the presentation. Do you advocate working with staff for substantial amounts of time before restorative or SEL work begins with the young people themselves?
That's a great question. I think that in terms of the empirical base for that, do we start with the adults? Do we start with the kids? It's really, we don't know. We don't have a lot of research to know kind of where to begin. However, there's certainly been arguments made that to move into restorative work, the staff themselves need to come together as a community and have a lot of experiential learning around community building processes and resolution. But I say that with a caveat of how powerful it can be to engage students in the forefront as becoming agentic in eliciting change. So from an empirical standpoint, we don't know quite yet where the kind of leverage points is. And frankly, it probably is going to go back to Rob's point that it really depends on the context and what's needed within that context.
Great, thank you. And Camille, next for you, did the findings of the classroom survey surprise you in any way?
You know what surprised me was, so it didn't surprise me that classroom context really mattered for how young people experience themselves and experience learning, and how much energy and effort they were willing to expend in that. That did not surprise me. What did surprise me is that I kind of thought that there would be more consensus within a classroom about the rating of that classroom. So we asked students, there were 16 questions about the classroom conditions, and that mostly was about teacher practices to create a community and to be supportive of individual students. So there's questions like, the teacher knows my strengths and weaknesses in this class, and you know, I understand what it is we're trying to learn and how it connects to other things we've learned. So those kinds of things. And I was expecting that, you know, there would be really good classes that everybody thought were really good, and then, you know, some not so good classes that everybody thought were not so good. But really, within every classroom, there was quite a wide variety of students' reports in terms of how they rated that class. And so what surprised me was the variability within each classroom. And what I take away from that is just how these are really subjective experiences that each individual student's having, that are shaped by a whole host of things, both inside and outside of the classroom, and that it really is important for educators to be connected with kids so that they can understand kind of where they are and how they are experiencing what they're doing, what the teacher is doing, because I think it less matters what the teacher is doing or intending to do, and much more matters how kids are actually experiencing that. So being in touch with that and realizing that there might be quite a bit of variability in that.
Great, thank you. And David, I'm going to flip back a couple slides while I ask you this question, which is, what makes the 4-quadrant social and emotional conditions for engagement? What is SEL about all of them versus the SE competencies quadrant?
Great. Okay. Well, first of all, let me say that we completed, again, my colleague Juliet Berg and I, but with the active involvement of hundreds of practitioners and researchers, looked at the relationship between school climate and SEL. And what we found is there is this inextricable link, and that I think the key part of it is those things that are part of the subjective experience of young people that Camille's talking about. It really is about issues of safety, about connectedness and support and so forth. But let me be very concrete quickly. So if you look at work like Zaretta Hammond's very wonderful practice-oriented work, she makes the point, which we make in the Science of Learning Development work, that for students to take risks, including to develop new skills and connect with adults, they have to feel emotionally safe. They also have to feel supported. And I think that when students feel that teachers really have their back, that teachers respect them, that teachers listen to their agency and their voice, they're more likely to be able to be honest, to be frank, and also to do the things that will help them not only learn SEL as a skill, I should say social emotional learning as skill giving, but to help them really make these portable competencies that they're able to appropriate and use in other environments. And that really requires students feeling comfortable enough to do that. In addition, what we know is the fact that there is ongoing social learning going on. And so very quickly, we just looked at 5 years of longitudinal data from Cleveland, and we looked at 2 things against each other: students' development of self-regulation and students' reports on the social and emotional competencies and values of their peers. And what we found was a trajectory going up, even against what we know about what happens as young people become a little older and they enter into middle school, but more importantly, also that these 2 things co-influenced each other. That if you looked at one, you saw how it contributed to the other and vice versa. So there is this inextricable linkage, I think.
Great. Well, thank you. And I know I speak for everyone when I say that I am sad that our time has run out together because you all have such wonderful information and insights to share with us. So thank you again for joining us, and congratulations again to all 3 of our winners of the Joseph Easons Award. I would again like to thank CASEL for sponsoring the awards as well as today's webinar, and you can find out more about the awards at the CASEL website. And if you have specific questions for any of our panelists today, their contact information is here on this final slide. As I've mentioned before, you will receive an email tomorrow that includes a lot of information, which will be a link to today's recording, a link to the PowerPoint slides, as well as access to lots of different materials that our panelists have provided, and some of the published articles of Joseph Easons himself. So be on the lookout for that, and thank you again for joining us today. One final request from you: when you log off, if you wouldn't mind taking the very short survey that will pop up. We just would appreciate your feedback, as well as any requests you have for additional webinars that you might like to have Castle produce for you. So thanks again for joining us, and to our award winners, and we hope everyone has a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.